Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are stepping away from our world, leaving it quite far behind, actually.
We are. We're heading back. Way back.
All the way back to ancient Athens, specifically the spring of 399 BCE. We're placing ourselves right in the middle of the city's popular law courts, the dicasteria.
Yeah, and this isn't, the glorious Athens you might picture from its peak. This is a city in deep trouble, a moment of, well, profound national trauma.
Drama is the right word. They're reeling from a crushing military defeat in the Peloponnesian War.
Right, and not just defeat, but also the recent memory of the 30 tyrants, this brutal oligarchic regime. So there's this deep-seated suspicion, maybe even paranoia, gripping the city.
Athens feels vulnerable, wounded, and it often happens in these situations. They're looking for someone or something to blame.
And that blame, that focus, it lands squarely on one figure, a very famous one even then, annoying to some, brilliant to others, the philosopher Socrates.
So there he is, standing before this huge jury, 501 of his fellow citizens. He's literally fighting for his life. And this trial, it becomes this pivotal moment, maybe even a moment of civic self-destruction, you could argue.
Definitely. And our mission today, it isn't just to retell the story of his death. We want to put you, the listener, right there, inside that jury box, so to speak. We want to understand the why.
Exactly. We're diving deep into the Socratic ideas themselves, drawing from sources like Xenophon's Memorabilia, Plato, of course, and other texts on Athenian law.
We want to see precisely how his philosophical teachings clashed, really clashed, with what this traumatized city needed politically and religiously.
So we'll break down those two big charges,
Yeah.
impiety, asabia, and corrupting the youth.
Yeah, and show how these weren't just, abstract philosophical debates. They were rooted in very real political fears, making Socrates, perhaps tragically, the perfect scapegoat.
The easy scapegoat for a city just trying to find its feet again? Okay, let's start there with that context. The anxieties running through Athens.
Right. You absolutely have to grasp the mood, the psychological weight on Athens in 399 BCE. They'd lost their empire, suffered this humiliating starvation siege by Sparta, endured the 30 tyrants and their reign of terror, mass executions, confiscations.
And democracy had only just been restored, right? It must have felt incredibly fragile.
Exactly, fragile. And when a democracy feels that fragile, it doesn't tend to embrace nuance or dissent. It craves stability. It demands visible conformity. Anyone who seems out of step becomes suspicious.
And we know that Athenian politics was already, let's say, rough and tumble. Using the legal system to target opponents wasn't unusual, was it?
Oh, not at all. It was a standard operating procedure. Think back even decades earlier. Pericles, the great statesman. Even at his peak, his enemies went after his friends and associates through the courts. It was an indirect way of attacking him.
A proxy fight.
Precisely. And you see it even earlier with powerful families like the Alcmeonids, constantly targeted by rivals, spreading rumors like that infamous one about them signaling the Persians after Marathon. Why? Because they were visible, powerful, and maybe convenient targets for existing grudges, existing enmities.
Okay, so this idea of enmity seems crucial. It wasn't just abstract political disagreement. It was personal, deeply personal.
Very much so. And that brings us to the legal structure itself, which kind of revolved around this core concept.
Decay.
Deco, tell us about that. It sounds important.
It is hugely important. It's a fundamental term from that era, 5th century Greece. But it's much richer, much more complex than just our word justice.
How so?
While deco covers a whole spectrum, it can mean the big, abstract idea of right or a cosmic order, but also means the very concrete things like a law court or a specific law case, and it even carries the sense of retribution or punishment.
Wow, so it's everything from high philosophy down to the nitty-gritty of a legal dispute. Exactly. It's the framework for social order. It defines how society should be organized. And it is the legal process for hashing out conflicts, whether they're private feuds or, like in Socrates' case, seemingly public offenses.
And you mentioned the system relied on private action?
Critically so. Athens didn't have, like, a district attorney's office. There were no state prosecutors, in our sense. For almost everything, even serious charges against the state, like impiety, the system depended entirely on private citizens stepping up to bring the prosecution.
Ordinary citizens.
Yep. And what motivated them? Often, it was personal animosity, what the Greeks called ekthra, enmity.
Ekthra. So personal grudges were actually formalized within the legal system.
They were essentially baked into it. Think about a homicide case, for instance.
Yep.
Okay, the state oversaw the trial. It was public. But the duty and the right to seek vengeance, to pursue the case, fell to the victim's family. The law basically provided the channel for them to exercise their ekthra and get daiko.
So the personal feeling of wanting revenge was part of the process.
Absolutely. The sources are clear that feeling of personal animosity was deeply tied into the legal system, especially in capital trials.
Which brings us back to Socrates. His trial, okay, the charges were public impiety, corrupting the youth, but the guys bringing the charges, Miletus, Candace, Lycon, they weren't impartial officials.
Not at all. They were private citizens, almost certainly driven by their own myths of political disagreements and personal ecthra against Socrates and what he represented. The trial's outcome really depended on whether they could successfully weaponize that ecthra.
And could they? Were the courts receptive to that kind of approach?
Oh, highly receptive. The Athenian popular courts, these huge juries, 501 citizens, sometimes more, they were known for it. We have ancient sources criticizing them for things like slackness, frivolity, emotional instability, or simple-mindedness.
Well, that doesn't sound like a recipe for objective legal judgment.
Not really. It was more like a democratic political assembly acting as a court. It was highly susceptible to persuasion, to emotion.
So the lawyers, the orators, they played on that.
Absolutely. They didn't focus on dry legal points. They appealed directly to the jurors' feelings. Orators like Lysias, a famous one, were masters at it. He'd explicitly tell jurors to get angry or geistai, to feel that desire for vengeance, both personal and for the city.
Wow.
He even, in some speeches, rhetorically suggested applying talio, an eye for an eye, telling the jury to strike back hard against opponents accused of harming the city or its citizens.
That's incredible. So for Socrates, the trial wasn't really about proving technical guilt beyond a reasonable doubt.
Much less so, I'd argue, it was about positioning him. Could the accuser successfully paint him as an extros, an enemy? An enemy of the recovering democracy, an enemy of the traditional ways, an enemy of the city's stability?
Could they tap into that collective fear, that post-war trauma, that desire for someone to blame?
Exactly. His fate wasn't going to be decided by calm deliberation over legal statutes. It was going to be swayed by the heavy weight of recent history and the raw emotions of those 501 jurors.
Okay, so let's dig into that first specific charge. Aspeia, impiety. Now, on the surface, Socrates often sounds quite devout in the dialogues, doesn't he? Always talking about the gods, his divine sign.
He does. But it's the way he talks about divinity, the specific doctrines Xenophon attributes to him, that's the problem. His approach was highly personalized, very rationalized, and that put him directly at odds with what the state needed from religion.
What do you mean? What was so radical?
Well, Xenophon gives us a really clear example. Socrates' teaching on prayer. He told his followers to pray very simply, just ask the gods to give the good things.
That sounds quite pious, uncontroversial maybe.
It sounds it, right. But the philosophy behind it is actually revolutionary and deeply threatening to traditional Athenian religion.
Why? What's the underlying idea?
The core idea is human ignorance, profound ignorance. Socrates argued, according to Xenophon, that we humans simply don't know what's ultimately good for us. You might pray for, say, a military command, but maybe getting that command leads to your death or disgrace.
Or you pray for wealth and it gets you robbed.
Exactly. So, since we're ignorant, and the gods possess the most noble knowledge of what's truly good, the only safe and logical thing to do is trust their wisdom completely. Just ask for generic good things and let them sort it out.
Ah, I see. That completely undermines the usual way of doing things, doesn't it? Traditional Greek religion was very transactional.
Very much so. It was like a contract. You give the gods a specific sacrifice, you make a vow, you perform a ritual, and you expect a specific outcome in return: victory in battle, a good harvest, health for your family.
It was about concrete results.
Yeah.
And it was public, collective.
Yes, civic piety was a political necessity. And Socrates' simple prayer implicitly dismisses many common and even legally required prayers as foolish or pointless.
What kind of prayers?
Well, the sources mention things like praying for gold, silver, political power like tyranny. But the really explosive one is praying for victory in battle.
Okay, that's the political dynamite. Rejecting prayer for military victory in post-war Athens.
You can see how dangerous that sounds, right? This is a city whose very survival depended on military strength and divine favor in war. The city's laws mandated public prayers and sacrifices to gods like Athena and Ares, specifically for military success, for protection against enemies.
So if Socrates is teaching the city's young men, potential future leaders and soldiers, not to pray for victory,
then he is, as the source material puts it, acutely at odds with prayer dictated by the law of the city. He's essentially privatizing religion. He's telling people to disconnect their personal piety from the state's collective needs, especially its need for security and military success.
And does this view on prayer connect to things like divination, oracles, omens.
It certainly seems to discourage them. If the gods already know what's best and will provide the good things anyway, why bother trying to pry into the future or seek specific guidance through divination?
Which was a huge part of Athenian public life, right? Consulting oracles before big decisions.
Absolutely essential. Major state decisions, especially military campaigns, were often preceded by consulting oracles or interpreting omens. Think about the disastrous Sicilian expedition Nicias, the general, delaying the retreat because of a lunar eclipse, a bad omen.
Mm.
Whether you think it was right or wrong, divination was a recognized state mechanism for trying to understand the god's will.
So Socrates' approach kind of bypasses that whole system.
It does. It replaces it. Instead of these, somewhat unpredictable interventionist gods of traditional belief gods who could get angry, who needed appeasement, who were tied to specific places and civic functions, Socrates seems to be moving towards a more universal, rationalized concept of the divine, a divinity defined by noble knowledge and inherent goodness.
And that contrasts sharply with how many Athenians probably felt, especially after the war.
Definitely. For many ordinary Athenians, especially after suffering defeat and hardship, the gods were very much involved, sometimes punishing human mistakes or hubris. Think about the soldiers dying on the retreat from Syracuse. Many would have seen that as divine punishment for impiety or for ignoring warnings. Socrates is calm, rational God who always knows best. Well, it removes that element of fear and the need for constant appeasement that underpins so much of civic religion. His God was a philosopher's God, not the city's God.
Which makes the charge of aceibia, impiety, seem much less about atheism and much more about undermining the foundations of civic religious practice.
Precisely. It was a political charge dressed up in religious clothing.
Okay, so if impiety targeted the state's relationship with the gods, its external security in a way, then the second charge, corrupting the youth, seems aimed at its internal stability, its future.
That's a good way to put it. And again, this wasn't about teaching kids to, steal or commit vandalism. It was about something much more fundamental, teaching them to question the core values the city relied on. Values like unquestioning loyalty, obedience to tradition, prioritizing the collective good.
And where does that alleged corruption start? What specific Socratic teachings were seen as so dangerous?
It really starts with his whole approach to Sophia, to wisdom. In one dialogue with Euthydemus, Socrates talks about wisdom leading to self-knowledge and helping you get good things. Sounds fine, right?
Sounds like the goal of education, generally.
But then Socrates throws in this huge curveball. He reminds Euthydemus of stories from sacred tradition, stories where precisely wisdom has led great individuals of the past into misery.
Misery. How?
Things like slavery under barbarians and the death of their loved ones as well as themselves. He suggests wisdom isn't some kind of automatic guarantee of success or freedom. It could even lead to disaster, like ending up enslaved by the Persians.
Wow. For an Athenian jury, especially after the Peloponnesian War and the fear of foreign domination, hearing that wisdom might lead to slavery, that must have sounded incredibly subversive.
Deeply subversive. It directly challenged the common assumption that intellectual pursuits, becoming wise, automatically benefits you and benefits the state. If wisdom can lead to misery, what's the point? Especially, what's the point for the city?
And this wasn't just an abstract philosophical point for the jury, was it? There was a much more concrete, much more damaging connection they could make.
Ah, yes. The elephant in the courtroom, essentially. Socrates' former associates.
Critias and Alcibiades.
Exactly. Two of the most notorious figures in recent Athenian history. Critias, the ruthless leader of the 30 tyrants, the oligarchy that terrorized Athens, and Alcibiades, the brilliant but treacherous general whose ambition arguably doomed the Sicilian expedition and ultimately harmed Athens immensely.
And both of them had been close to Socrates, part of his circle.
Yes. They were known to have spent time with him, learned from him, engaged in philosophical discussions with him. So for the prosecution, and likely for many jurors, the corruption wasn't theoretical anymore. They saw the practical results. These incredibly intelligent, philosophically influenced men had brought disaster upon the city.
So Socrates' teaching, regardless of his own personal intentions, could be seen as the intellectual breeding ground for tyranny and treason.
That's almost certainly how the accusers framed it. When Socrates warns that Sophia can lead to misery, the jury isn't just thinking of ancient myths, they're thinking of Critias, they're thinking of Alcibiades. It makes his entire educational project seem dangerous. It destabilizes the value of philosophical inquiry itself from the perspective of the state's needs.
He also seems to have had challenging things to say about self-control or enkritia.
Yes, this is another key area. He taught that self-mastery, enkratia, was the kroipos, the footing, the foundation for virtue. You need self-control to do good things.
Okay, that sounds reasonable. Like discipline.
But then he makes this subtle but crucial distinction. He says self-mastery isn't inherently noble, kalon in itself. It's only good, agathon, for one who's doing something noble.
So self-control is just a tool. The real value lies in the noble action itself.
Right. And who gets to define what's truly noble? Well, implicitly, the philosopher does. But more pointedly, he defines the lack of self-mastery in very harsh terms. He calls it the worst enslavement.
Enslavement? To what?
To the worst despot's bodily pleasures. He says this lack of self-control prevents you from doing the best things and actually compels you to do the worst things.
Okay, strong language. But where does the political danger come in?
It comes in with the analogy he uses. It's politically incendiary.
Yeah.
He points out that obviously you wouldn't tolerate a lack of self-mastery even in your slaves. They need discipline to be useful.
Right. Makes sense in their context.
But then he turns it on the free citizens of Athens.
Hmm.
He says if free men lack this Socratic self-mastery, they should actually pray the gods that one might happen upon good masters.
Ouch. That's incredibly insulting in a democracy built on the ideal of eleutheria, freedom.
It's the ultimate insult. He's basically saying that free Athenian men who don't live up to his philosophical standard of self-control are no better than slaves and maybe even need masters. That sounds like utter contempt for the average citizen and for democratic values. It confirms the suspicion that he looks down on them.
Which feeds directly into the corrupting the youth charge, teaching them to feel superior, to disdain the common citizen.
Exactly. And this connects to his views on authority, too. Formally, yes, his teaching on sophrosuna, moderation, was tied to justice, defined as obedience to law, including divine law. That sounds fine.
But there's a catch.
There's a catch. When he discusses leadership, like being a general, he talks about needing oratorical rhetoric about the noble, but suggests this needs to be combined with what is truly good or beneficial.
Implying that traditional rhetoric or understanding might not be enough.
Precisely. It implicitly sets up the philosopher Socrates himself as the ultimate expert on what is truly noble and beneficial. He knows better than the generals, better than the politicians, better than tradition.
So philosophical inquiry, his method, is placed above the city's established laws and values.
That's the implication. He's teaching young men, the future leaders, that they should subject the city's traditions and authorities to their own individual, rational Socratic examination. And that is the core of the political charge of corruption, undermining respect for inherited authority and encouraging intellectual arrogance.
So we've got this perfect storm brewing, a philosopher whose ideas about gods and wisdom directly challenge the city's needs, combined with a traumatized democracy looking for scapegoats, and a legal system fueled by personal enmity and emotion.
It's a collision course, and the mechanics of the trial itself, combined with Socrates' own actions, pretty much guarantee the outcome.
Let's talk about those mechanics. How did a capital trial like this actually work in Athens? You mentioned the huge jury.
Right, 501 citizens. And it was typically a two-stage process. First, the jury votes simply on guilt or innocence, guilty or not guilty.
And Socrates was found guilty.
He was. The prosecution team, Anidas, Miletus, Lycon, they succeeded. They managed to convince a majority, albeit perhaps a narrow one according to some sources, that Socrates was indeed an ekthros, an enemy, guilty as charged.
They must have been pretty confident or very motivated to bring such a high-profile case. Was there any risk for them if they lost?
There was some risk. While our best details on penalties for failed prosecutions come from later Roman law, which penalized vexatious litigation, we know Athenian prosecutors could face sanctions, like a fine or losing certain civic rights, if they failed to get a minimum percentage of the jury votes, usually 1/5. So yes, they needed to be reasonably sure they could sway a significant portion of the jury, or else be driven very strongly by that extra.
But conviction didn't automatically mean death, did it?
Not necessarily in this type of case. That came in the second stage. If the verdict was guilty, then you move to the penalty phase. The accusers would propose a penalty. In this case, they proposed death.
And the defendant.
The defendant got to propose a counter penalty, an alternative punishment. This was called the antilogia. This was Socrates' chance, potentially, to save his own life.
What were his options? What could he have proposed?
He could have proposed exile, leave Athens forever. That was a common outcome. Or he could have proposed a substantial fine. Given his connections, his friends likely could have helped him pay it. Either of these might have been acceptable to a jury that was perhaps angry but not necessarily bloodthirsty.
But that's not what he did. His defense, his whole demeanor throughout the trial, as Plato and Xenophon portray it, was, well, unconventional.
Unconventional is putting it mildly. It was politically suicidal. The jury, especially after finding him guilty, would have expected some show of deference, some plea for mercy, maybe an acknowledgement of error.
It's humility, basically.
Exactly. But Socrates gave them the opposite. His defense wasn't really a defense in the traditional sense. It was a reaffirmation of his life's work. He essentially doubled down.
How so?
He argued that his philosophical mission, his constant questioning, his making people uncomfortable, the very things he was accused of, wasn't corruption at all. He claimed it was a divine service he was performing for the city, a gift from the god meant to wake Athens up like a gadfly stinging a lazy horse. He argued he was making the citizens better, more virtuous, by forcing them to examine their lives.
That takes some serious nerve, telling the people who just found you guilty that you were actually doing them a favor.
Immense nerve,
Mm-hmm.
or perhaps profound commitment to his principles. And then came the antilogy, the counter-penalty proposal. This was the moment of truth.
What did he propose instead of death?
This is the truly astonishing part. Instead of exile or a fine, he proposed that he deserved a reward.
A reward.
Yes. He suggested the appropriate penalty for him was to be given free meals for life at public expense in the Prytaneum.
The Prytaneum. That's like the city hall, isn't it? Where they honored Olympic heroes and major public benefactors?
Exactly. The highest civic honor imaginable. He was basically saying, you think I deserve punishment. Actually, you should be honoring me like a national hero for my service to you.
I can only imagine how that went down with the jury.
Predictably badly. It was seen as the ultimate act of hubris. Arrogance beyond belief. Contempt for the court, contempt for the verdict, contempt for the city.
So any jurors who might have been on the fence about the death penalty?
This likely pushed them over the edge. The sources suggest that the vote margin for the death sentence was significantly larger than the margin for the initial guilty verdict. Jurors who might have been willing to vote for exile or a fine were apparently so enraged by his counterproposal, by his refusal to bend, that they swung decisively towards execution.
He sealed his own fate with his defiance.
In a very real sense, yes. He chose philosophical consistency and perhaps what he saw as his divine duty over political expediency or even self-preservation. His unconventional defense, rooted in his core beliefs, was the final nail in his coffin.
So the verdict wasn't just about the charges anymore. It was about his refusal to play the expected role, his insistence on his own unique superior wisdom in the face of democratic judgment.
It became a judgment on his entire life and attitude. As the historian I.F. Sohn provocatively argued, you could almost say he was executed by the victims of his own educational methods, the very people he claimed to be helping, but who felt alienated and insulted by his approach. #tagoutro. So when we dive deep like this, looking at the sources and the context, the conviction of Socrates starts to look less like a sudden aberration and more like, well, almost an inevitable tragedy.
Yeah, it seems like a collision of these two massive forces. You summarized them well. First, that fundamental clash over religion.
Right. His very personal, rationalized approach to the divine, especially rejecting prayers for things the city desperately needed, like military victory, versus the collective transactional civic piety that Athens relied on for its social cohesion and sense of security. He broke the unspoken religious contract.
And second, that clash over education and values.
Exactly. His focus on self-examined wisdom, which he himself admitted could lead to misery, and which was associated with figures like Critias and Alcibiades, versus the state's desperate need for loyal, obedient citizens, especially among the youth. His questioning of tradition looked like subversion in their paranoid state.
So stepping back, what does this nearly 2,500-year-old trial tell us? What's the takeaway?
Well, for me, it highlights this incredibly difficult, maybe permanent tension within democracy itself. You have the will of the people expressed through the jury, but what happens when that jury, as the ancient critics suggested, is susceptible to emotion, to fear, to ecthra, to political manipulation?
Especially when the person on trial is a philosopher, someone whose job, in a way, is to question the status quo, to make people uncomfortable.
Precisely. Philosophical inquiry, genuine critical thinking, by its very nature, challenges a community's comfortable assumptions. But in Athens, that same community was the judge and jury. How can you protect dissent, protect the Socratic gadfly, when the horse decides whether the gadfly lives or dies?
And you mentioned earlier, knowledge is only valuable when understood and applied. So was the failure here the jury's failure to understand Socrates' deeper purpose, his commitment to truth?
Or was it a failure of application? A failure to apply principles like fairness and reason when faced with someone whose ideas fundamentally scared them or challenged their worldview. It's hard to say for sure.
It leaves us with a really profound question, doesn't it? How does a democracy, which relies on the will of the majority, protect the minority voice of intellectual dissent, especially when that dissent seems threatening? Socrates' trial forces us to confront who really gets to decide what counts as truth and what price we're willing to pay for challenging it.
It's a question that hasn't gone away, still resonates today, absolutely.